Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. And I always exhort everybody, myself included, at the end of each one of these episodes to be brave. And I promised you that I would bring people who are brave, just talking who are speaking out on a lot of these subjects when it's not necessarily comfortable for them to do so. And that's the reason I'm really proud to welcome Paula Scanlan to High Noon. Paula is a swimmer. She's a graduate of Pennsylvania, UPenn, and she's now out in the adult world. But she has joined her former teammate Riley Gaines in speaking out about some of the issues surrounding biological sex in women's sports. So, Paula, welcome to High Noon. I'm really happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell me about yourself. Tell our audience about yourself. How did you end up swimming to begin with? How did you find it as a passion? And so how did you end up getting mixed up in some of these political and sensitive topics?
Yeah, so when I was in 3rd grade, the YMCA in my town actually had finished building an Olympic-sized pool. That was, like, a really big deal. So my parents said that I needed to get into a sport to kind of have, like, an after-school hobby, and it was just coincidental the year my dad decided to tell me this in 3rd grade that the pool had been finished. So at that point, I kinda joined the swim team. It was, like, twice a week, not a huge commitment, and I did it for a few years very unseriously. Um, and so when I was in 6th grade, my brother went off to college, and all my friends had moved up onto this program, this, like, more advanced level, and the coaches were like, "She's not dedicated, she's not prepared to do this." My parents were like, "Can we just try?" So I started as, like, the slowest person in the last lane, and by the end of the month, I had moved up into, like, the 2nd lane. I just started taking it super seriously once my brother went to college, because I wanted to have something that was my own, and then from that point, I didn't miss any practices. It was all in. Swimming was, like, the number one thing I wanted to do. So that was, like, how I started, and then, obviously, I kept doing it through high school. My high school had a pretty successful run. We won our high school league, my junior and senior year. And when it came to picking colleges, my brother actually went to Penn as well, and so I wanted to kind of follow in his footsteps, but also have my own twist on it because he wasn't an athlete in college, and he wasn't, ever that dedicated to athletics, so it was, like, my way of going to the same school, but doing it my way. So that's kinda how I ended up at Penn.
And can you tell us a little bit about sort of the timeline of how Leah, formerly Will Thomas, joined the team, sort of how the team initially dealt with that, and then what you thought about it when you heard that a biologically male teammate was going to join sort of your half of the locker room between these two male and female sides of the same team?
Yeah, so, my freshman year of college, there was no talk about transgenders and, you know, people competing on other teams. But, the first month of my sophomore year, so the fall of 2019, um, there was a team meeting, and notably, the meeting was very interesting because the men's team had a meeting first, and then the women's team had a meeting after. And our school was a combined program, so meetings where the men and women were separated were very, very, very rare. So we all didn't really know what to expect, and we go into this meeting, and at the time, Will Thomas, we go in with our coach. Will Thomas is there, and I'm like, "Oh, why is there a member of the men's team here?" It was very confusing, and our coach just said, "Will, this is your meeting, take the floor." And then just said, "I'm transgender and I'm going to be transitioning to the women's team." It was very, very brief, less than 5 minutes. There wasn't really any questions. Everybody was just like, "Oh, congrats, welcome." And then our coach said, "Everybody get in the pool." And that was the last we talked about it formally as a team. And even when this season actually begun, there wasn't even meetings before the season of 20 fall 2021 when it actually happened. We didn't have any meetings preempting that season to discuss it. It was just Leah was there one day and Leah's a member of the team.
And how did you feel about that initially? You said it was pretty universally sort of congrats. That was that was the initial response. And I know this happened kind of before and after COVID as well, right? So there was a big break in the middle. I mean, how did this issue start to bubble up in the team? I mean, did you and the other girls talk about this? Did anyone voice that they might be uncomfortable with it initially? I mean, how did those conversations develop, and how did your coaches and the university respond to them?
Yeah, so initially I couldn't really read the room on how comfortable people were or weren't with the situation. It's very, very hard to tell when it's shocking whether someone's just shocked or whether they're excited. So I personally just kept to myself about the opinions. But I did talk to my friends who were outside the team about it. I talked to my family about it, just saying, this is crazy. And at this point for me, I didn't know anything about the rules. So I said, oh, okay, there's a year of transition. There must be some protocol. So I go down and I start researching testosterone and the effects of testosterone on the body and all of that. And I start reading the NCAA handbook, just because I had no idea what any of the rules were and what to expect from this entire situation. And, you know, I found immediately that the the changes in your testosterone level are very unclear how much that actually affects your athletic ability. There was a lot of studies that were done on like lowering men's testosterone and seeing how they're affected in athletic sense, and it was very very unclear at best. So that was definitely concerning. But in terms of people in the team, it was just obviously you want to be inclusive, and the environment of 20 something year old girls is always to be inclusive. So amongst my team members, it was very much we would just have conversations, just saying, oh, how's Will feeling? Is Will comfortable? Or, oh, why don't we invite Will to this event so that they can start being more comfortable with the women's team when they do eventually join. So that was the conversation among the teams in that transition year that after it was announced.
And and then after you took this break, right? Because there just was no competition for a while during COVID. After you came back on the flip side, and this had by then this had started to become a media sensation, right? There were media outlets reporting on the fact that Will, now calling himself Leah, was swimming and competing against women because it was just such a like sort of shocking, visually shocking thing. Like he's not a small guy. He's physically much more imposing than the women that he was standing next to the podium on. There starts to be a media circus around this. How did the atmosphere and the team behind the scenes change when that started to happen?
Yeah, so as competition begun, I would have one-on-one conversations with my teammates, and I would say, "Oh, like, what do you guys think about this?" And, people would, voice their concerns one-on-one. Like, there was a teammate of mine who mentioned, "I think we should put an asterisk on the record board." Um, and another girl who said, maybe the Leah should compete exhibition, meaning, like, get to compete with the women's team, but their times don't count. Um And a lot of people had this conversation, but there was never a formal meeting about this. And the thing that's so interesting to me is you could have these conversations with people, but then as a group, everyone would always just say, this is so amazing. We're really proud of you. We're part of this great team. But it was like the same people who you would have one on one conversations with knowing that they disagreed. So it was a very confusing situation to navigate of like, is someone telling me this because this is what they think I want to hear? Or are they afraid of just seeming bad to a full group? And it was just so difficult to gauge what everyone actually thought about it because everyone was saying, two different things about the whole situation. So at this point, I just tried to really limit my conversations to just one-on-one conversations with people. I never talked to more than one person, and just trying to really be careful about who I spoke to and how I presented my side of what I thought was going on.
And how did your coaches? I mean, did anybody go to the coaches? And then how did the university respond to these one-on-one conversations that were happening on your team?
So a lot of girls went to our coaches individually and just raised concerns about it. I talked a lot to our assistant coach at the time, and she obviously just said like, my job as a coach is to be supportive of my athletes, and there's nothing I can really do. And my head coach had similar sentiments, but um, sh- like other girls went to the athletic department directly. I honestly never did that because I didn't really trust them. But it wasn't until the media really started picking up that the athletic department came in and actually sat us down and had a team meeting and told us, like, to stay away from the media, which I thought was very interesting because I think they should have definitely addressed it earlier if that's what they wanted us to do. But it was already many months into the season that they decided to actually formally have a chat with us about what was going on and how, there's nothing we can do to get Leah off the team. Leah will be completing the season no matter what. You guys just have to be okay with that.
My family is from, and I think your family's from Taiwan, are they not?
Yeah.
So
my mom was born there.
My family is from Eastern Europe, and from communist Poland, and so I always grew up with sort of stories about, about authoritarian systems, about communism, about these kinds of whispered situations, and one of the famous sort of ways to get dissidents to shut up. One of the threats that was used, not as much I think in Poland, but in the Soviet Union itself, was to declare them mentally incompetent or insane, right? To suggest that having a different opinion makes you mentally incompetent. It seems like the university almost did this to you. They sent an email to the team. You talk a little bit about, one, they told you, Leah's going to stay on the team, right? And if you have a problem with it, don't talk to the media. But they also mentioned something that was quite disturbing to me about basically suggesting that anyone who had a problem with the idea of a man swimming on the women's team needed to seek psychological help.
Yeah. So they actually never put any of this in writing. And again, I actually saw Harvard actually did, which is very interesting. Penn was definitely very smart to do that. So backtracking this, it really started blowing up in the media at the beginning of December. We get an email from an assistant to the athletic director saying, "Hi girls, like addressed only to the women's team meeting in the stands, 4 o'clock. Everyone mandatory, you need to be there." And the interesting part about this is every other team meeting we've ever had has been set up by the captains or the coaches. So the fact that the athletic department was the one who sent this email, and I have the email proof that they did book this meeting, was very weird. And so I was in the early slot of practice. That meant I practiced before the meeting happened, and I was so anxious because I had no idea what they were going to say, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. So we go to this meeting and there was like 10 people standing there. It was our coaches. There was multiple people from the athletic department. There was someone from the LGBT center, someone from the psychological services. And, I think that was pretty much the panel of people that were there. And they just said a few things. The main takeaway was, don't talk to the media. They're not your friend. You will regret speaking to the media. Another thing they said is Leah swimming is a non-negotiable. And the third thing they said is, if you have issues with that, here are the resources that can help you be okay with that. One of which they offered us psychological services. So I thought that was very interesting that they were suggesting that we needed therapy in order to be okay with the situation. And that was definitely the most concerning. I mean, the rest of the people that were there, it was okay. I would have expected them to say not to talk to the media. Every other team in the Ivy League and other teams were told the same thing. Riley was told the same thing at the University of Kentucky. But I think the fact that they brought in psychological services was so scary, because it was basically suggesting that we needed to be re-educated. So that's the way I took it. They're suggesting they needed to have re-education. And again, like you mentioned about a lot of communist countries were doing that. And again, I didn't take them up on that. I don't think anyone did. But I would have been very curious to know what they would have said in a therapy session had you gone and talked to them about this.
Yeah, actually, nothing's new, even in America, because when I was in university, around 2009, I was part of the college Republicans. We did some public sort of protest. I can't even remember what it was. A free speech protest, basically. And I also got an email saying, referring me to the psychological department to deal with my psychological, quote unquote, problems for merely having a different opinion and putting it on a sign. And that also struck me as quite authoritarian and scary. After that meeting, right? Were your teammates and you able to have even those one-on-one conversations? Did people shut up? I mean, at what point did you ultimately decided, right, to write an anonymous op-ed about this? So how does that all factor into this?
Yeah, so immediately after this meeting, so the backtrack of this meeting is that I had already gone to the press, but they hadn't released the story yet. So they had this meeting, and then the next day, basically, my anonymous interview was published. So a lot of people interpreted that as I went to that meeting and immediately was like, I hate everyone here. I'm going to go do exactly what they told me not to do. But in reality, I had kind of done that before. So I knew that I had done that. I was really scared because I said, oh my gosh, I just went, around everything that they just told us. Um, and I didn't know how people were going to react to it. But obviously, I wasn't going to take it back because I never said anything that I regretted. I didn't, and I also wanted people to know that the girls on the team weren't okay with this. Part of the reason why I went to speak to some outlets anonymously was I didn't want the narrative to be that the girls in this team were accepting of something so unjust that was happening to us. So I didn't know what to do. I was thinking like, can I try to contact this reporter and retract it? I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I was talking to my parents. I was like, should I be worried? Talking to my brother. I just said, I'm just going to let it play out. And at this point, comes out, people figured out it was me. I told one girl I was doing it, word gets around. And then I started getting nasty text messages from my own teammates telling me I was a horrible transphobic person. And it was so stressful for me that I didn't want to talk to anyone on the team. I actually ended up getting physically ill from the entire situation. I got a 102-degree fever, couldn't practice, couldn't swim. I called my assistant coach and talked to her for 30 minutes about the whole situation, and she obviously felt for me. She felt bad. She didn't blame me for anything, but she didn't know how to handle it either. So at that point, I was like, okay, I'm never talking to the media ever again. Maybe I will in the future. I'm not sure, but at that moment in time, I was physically sick from everything that had happened. I just said, like, I need to just take a breath from this. So, I ended up just feeling really horrible. My teammates were really mad at me. No one would speak to me. And then just taking a few months of time, it took about another month. By the beginning of January, I was kind of right back to where I was. I was like, okay, no, I'm still going to talk to the media. I'm still going to make sure we do this. And so in January, I was approached by a friend who I actually knew from College Republicans, who wrote for the Daily Pennsylvanian, our school newspaper. And she said that they're interested in publishing a singular piece in opposition to Leah swimming because there was a bunch of pro Leah swimming articles coming out. So she approached me to do this, said it could be anonymous. And, I started working with an editor that was somebody else. And it was the most painful back and forth process where they gave me a bunch of rules and we had to just keep going back and forth. And I would write a sentence and they would delete it because it was too harsh, or they would just say, you can't say this, or they would just cut things out. And it was the most frustrating process in my entire life. When they end up publishing the article, half the sentences have been cut without my permission anyway. And then they end up retracting the entire thing within a few hours of it being up. So it was like all this time and energy of going back and forth for literally no article. And then the pro Leah article still came out and there was no opposition.
You really went out of your way. I mean, in places you've talked about this op-ed that you wrote, and you just kind of indicated it again. You went out of your way to, for example, I think, avoid using pronouns and to really lay out in the kindest possible way why this was unfair to you and your teammates. I guess, how did you feel when the response, even to you bending over backwards, it seems like when I was, looking through what you've said about this, you've bent over backwards to try to not be, offensive to anybody and just to say the truth in the nicest, kindest way possible, which is that there are differences between males and females, and it's not fair to you or the other girls on the team or the women who are swimming against against this biological man, not to recognize those differences. How did you feel after bending over like that far and sort of really, really trying your best to not be offensive when even that attempt was taken down basically a few hours after publication because it was considered so wildly out of the Overton window, so wildly offensive that it needed to be removed and retracted?
Honestly, I mean, I was shocked. I think my biggest thing is I had hope at every single stage of everything that happened throughout that year, and then in things in general, like, you always hope that the truth will prevail and the right thing will come in the end, and you have trust and you have faith. And so I think I just assumed that, "Oh, maybe we'll come back and we'll work together and we're gonna finish this piece." Like, I actually once it got retracted, I did actually think this editor was gonna come back to me and we were gonna somehow rework the piece and get it back up. I don't know why I believed that, but he actually stopped responding to me, and so I remember actually, funny enough, I was rereading, my text messages with this editor today just to kinda, like, refresh myself of the situation, and it was like, we had a conversation, he was like, "We'll keep you posted," and I said, "Okay," and he read it and didn't respond to me, so I messaged him back, like, a week after this whole thing had happened, and I was like, "Hey, any update?" And he, like, read the message and never responded to me. Um, and so it was at that point and then, like, eventually, I literally just kept calling him, and eventually, like, he picked up and just explained to me, like, "No, like, I'm frustrated at the Daily Pennsylvanian for this, and I'm really sorry that it happened this way, but we're done." Um, but the thing that's so funny to me is and I published this on my Twitter and people can read it, the article that ended up getting published was one of the softest pieces that's ever been written, like, ever. There was not a single word in there that was controversial or offensive. There was even an entire paragraph that talks about how I affirm Leah's decision to live their life as their true self or something along those lines. Do you know what I mean? Like there's just so many aspects and so many catering to the transgender individuals, to all of this stuff. Like the article was intended to dissect the NCAA's policy and how it's incorrect. That was the intention, and it was somehow this wild, crazy, offensive piece. And again, I can't validate this, but apparently half the staff was threatening to quit over having that article be up because it didn't stand for their daily Pennsylvanian values. Like, isn't the whole point of being a journalist that you're supposed to be able to read something that you don't agree with? My grandfather worked as a journalist. He had people he violently disagreed with, like, so much so that, he would scream at them until they were red in the face, but he still worked with them. He still read their papers. He still obviously was published alongside with them. So it's just insane.
So what changed your mind about coming out with your name attached to this? Because at this point, this piece is still written not under your name, right? It's still anonymous.
Yeah, well, so the piece, I mean, I've published them. I mean, it's nowhere on the Daily Pennsylvanian site. So for what it's worth, the piece doesn't exist. I mean, I put it up on my Twitter, but it doesn't really exist. But in terms of myself, I think for me, I just assumed that the situation we were put in was controversial, obviously, but also I thought it was a unique situation, right? I said, okay, I had this horrible experience. The NCAA wronged me, but they're not going to wrong every single team in the entire country, and they're not going to do this to every single sport. So I just said, you know what? I need to just forget about it, move on from swimming, and just go to the working world and just move on with my life. That's what I had told myself. And I had conversations with Riley about this and just said, I needed 1 year of my life to just be normal. But it would continue to eat up at me, and I would think about it, and I would cry at night about my experiences and hearing about this happening to other girls. And Peyton McNabb, the volleyball player, when I heard about her story, I like almost couldn't move. But she was severely concussed. She was, harmed for her, like her entire life was kind of altered by the situation of being spiked. The ball, I think the ball that hit her was, the speeds of higher than the fastest Olympians in volleyball, like the spike speed. And so it was just things like that, watching Riley get attacked when she was in San Francisco. And I just, things just continue to happen and it just kept getting worse. And I really did think that, changes would be made. Like, my voice is not needed in this fight. Everything will be fine. Again, back to the having hope, having faith. And then I kind of realized at a certain point that if you want something done right, you have to be willing to do it yourself. And that was really when I realized that if I have these opinions that are so strong that I'm not willing to speak about it, then why do I even spend my time and energy thinking about these things? So it was just a lot of back and forth with myself. And finally, I realized the right thing to do was to talk about it. And I'm really happy that I did because, again, there's so many opportunities to share our story. And we actually have an opportunity to really push change to get this right.
One of the things that I think you're participating in is there's a IW is helping put together this protest up in Knoxville, Tennessee. It's a different sport, right? Cycling. You know, uh, you're going to participate in that, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'll be there.
What message do you want to send to these athletic organizations, whether it's in cycling or in swimming or in all these other athletic competitions, about what it means to you and what it meant to you as an athlete to have your voice completely silenced like this?
Yeah, I think what these organizations need to know is that women are not second class citizens in this country. I think a lot of people really weaponize the fact that women are very agreeable. Women do not like to, make waves and make people upset. But if you're going to have women's sports, you need to be willing to protect us. If not, then we should just get rid of them altogether. If that's what you believe, these organizations, if you believe that biological men can be competing in our spaces, then why even spend the time and money to have women's sports to begin with? And if you're not willing to stand by us on this, then no women should compete. Well, let's just make our own female leagues. We shouldn't have to work with you guys if you're not willing to protect us. So that's my message to these organizations. I really think they need to take a stance and protect women. And if they're not willing to do that, we need to make it clear that we're not going to stand for this.
What do you think about the implications? Because obviously, this is as important as women's sports are to the athletes who are actually participating in them and the spectators and their families. Um, this really is a species. It's just one of those places where it's become so obvious, right, that we're not allowed to talk about the biological differences between men and women. I'm sure you've heard that we're putting biological males into women's prisons, for example, in a place where there's obviously the potential. You talk about the volleyball player who was injured, and we could talk about. I think there's also an MMA player, MMA fighter who was injured by a biological man. Competing and fighting against her. Her skull was cracked open, as far as I recall. So there are obvious dangers even within the sports context. But those dangers are even clearer in some of these more quote unquote real life situations, right? Like between incarcerated women and men. When you and I fly to the air, we go to the airport, if we set off the alarm or whatever, right? And the scanning, we count on the ability of the TSA to assign a woman to, pat us down potentially in like in an intimate way. That's certainly would not be comfortable with a man doing that at the airport. There's all these instances in which the truth of male and female differences is currently recognized. I mean, how do you think about women's sports in relation to all of these other ways in which I feel like women our opportunity to compete, like as on the sports field, right? Our opportunity to have some privacy when we're changing, for example, our opportunity to actually, protect ourselves and stay in and feel safe in spaces that are only for us and other women. Um, how do you think this fight relates to that broader sort of assault that's happening, seemingly in all kinds of basically anywhere where our society or law acknowledges that boys and girls are different, that men and women are different?
Yeah, I think sports is really like the public forum that these differences are most obvious. So for me personally, and again, I do personally agree that um the the attack that's happening in these bathrooms and these prisons is honestly arguably worse than what's happening in sports. But I think the importance of winning on sports is that can help set precedent to protect us in other spaces. I think the sports is the most public one. It's the one, everyone can visually see what's happening versus in these bathrooms, in these prisons, those are more behind closed doors. So if we can raise attention to this athletics issue and say, okay, this is not fair. Here you can clearly see men are superior to women in these events. Then we can take those wins and apply them to the other female spaces. So that's how I think they're all related. Now, obviously, I would love to get attention to every single one of those issues all at once. But I do think sports has the best angle again because you have public proof of this versus these prisons. It's so hard to get in contact with prisoners, and public bathrooms don't have cameras inside of them generally, right? Like you can't really see what's going on there, so the proof of the attacks are not going to be as evident. So we definitely think we do need to win on all of these things. I don't want people to think that we're forgetting about prisons and bathrooms and other women's spaces that are being invaded. But sports we can do first.
Yeah, I mean, sports are such a public, as you say, and physical activity. It's like I mean, how do you think about free speech and living in America, trying to relate back to some of the background that we share, coming from more authoritarian countries, our families coming from more authoritarian countries and regimes? I mean, do you think about us in America differently now, given that you've had this experience, not only of this unjust thing happening to you as a member of this swim team, but also the attempt to silence you, right? The attempt to shut you up, to pull your words down, from the internet, um, in this very Orwellian sort of fashion for simply noticing something that, as we just discussed, is really obvious in the sports context, right? It couldn't be clearer when you look at, a man, a big man like Lia Thomas, right? And you look at, like I said, next to his competitors, his female competitors, this is something that's so obvious. I mean, did it make you feel crazy? Uh, to have something that is to saying something that is that obvious, to have people respond in such a way to saying something that's just obviously true if you have a set of eyes.
Yeah, no, I definitely felt crazy. It's that's the tactic that they use though, and like you mentioned, they want you to feel crazy. They want you to feel isolated. They want to make sure no one wants to talk to you so that you are locked in your own thoughts. And I was a shell of myself second semester of my senior year. I didn't leave the house. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't want to talk to anyone because I just felt so defeated and I felt so wrong. And psychologically, it was very, very challenging. I didn't even know, like, what to do with myself. Um, and I think that is, like, the broader issue that this touches on. I think in general, free speech is starting to become a really big problem in this country. That's part of the reason why Elon Musk bought Twitter, and now Twitter is, pretty close to a free speech platform. Obviously, there's still some policy that has been in there before Elon came in. It's kind of grandfathered in, but before that happened, there was people getting thrown off Twitter left and right for saying things like, men and women are different or there are two sexes. And that's just scary because it's so obvious. I mean, it's just even if you ignore the human race, if you look at plants, you look at animals, right? There's male and female in most of these things that just exist around the world, and it's like how has that become controversial?
So how have things changed? I mean, have you gotten any messages from since you've come out under your real name, your face, not anonymously, and you've started speaking out? You've done some interviews with Fox, as far as I could see on the internet. You've had your story written up in major news outlets. How has how has your sort of private life reacted to that, right? Have you been getting messages from your teammates? Do they privately agree with you? Do you think any more female athletes in similar situations are going to come forward after you and Riley have sort of stepped into the spotlight?
Yeah, a few of my teammates have thanked me for what I'm doing. And I mean, they're not surprises. I pretty much think I knew exactly which girls from the team were going to reach out to me when I did come out, and it's pretty much exactly what I expected. There have been other people that aren't related to the swimming world that have reached out to me in like very, very, very weird ways. Like a guy that I like knew freshman year of high school messaged me on LinkedIn of all places. Someone from my middle school reached out to me. I haven't talked to this kid in maybe 10 years. So there's a lot of surprises of people I never expected to let alone see this, but care enough to just tell me that they agree with me and they support me. So it's definitely been very, very surprising in that sense. Obviously, I do hope other girls from my team feel, willing to speak out, and I think that they might eventually. I haven't given up on that. I think other people in that sphere, are still scared, and I hope that they won't be, and I hope that I can help support them in however they need to feel comfortable. But I think it definitely would be very important to me also to have somebody backing up, everything that I've said. So I'm still hopeful for that, but definitely, and I hope other athletes in other sports that have been through this also feel courage to speak up because the more voices we have, the harder it's going to be to shut us down.
Paula Scanlan, thank you so much for joining High Noon. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. As always, you can send comments and questions to inez.stepman@iwf.org. Please help us out by hitting the subscribe button and leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or iwf.org. Be brave, like Paula Scanlan, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.